Yes, that's. Well, I hope everybody can hear clearly. I certainly can. Well, welcome everybody to the first of this season's Scottish Wildlife Trust Stirling and Clacks Group Winter Talks. I think this is the 23rd year that we've held them. And I would particularly like to welcome the students, which we've just established are here. They come from the Wildlife Conservation Society at Stirling University. Now, as you're aware, all of this winter's talks will be run exclusively online. And I would like to start off by apologising on behalf of the committee to all those who prefer to have live talks, as we did last year. We actually got as far as booking the hall this year so that we could have live talks, but we found that we couldn't guarantee to have enough members to run with the necessary IT skills to run hybrid talks. That's live talks, which were also carried on Zoom. One major reason for this is that the 5 younger members of the committee often have work commitments which take them away from home, and often they work at night, particularly on things like bat surveys. So we couldn't guarantee that there would be the 8 people that we required each week to do this. So I apologise, but perhaps we can get more members and arrange to go back to hybrid meetings. Now, tonight I can tell you that we're in for a treat because I've heard this talk before. Our speaker is Dr. John Holland, who you can see there on, well, I can see him on my screen anyway. His subject is the wildlife of the head of Loch and the surrounding Tay Marshes, sites of special scientific interest. Now, John has lived in Culzean. I guess there might be foreign students here who have no idea where Culzean is, but it's about, 40 miles north of Stirling? Or something like that, just where the big mountains start. He's an upland ecologist at the Hill and Mountain Research Centre, which is part of Scotland's Rural College, or the SRUC as it's known. This research centre is based on 2 farms near Crean-Larach. The centre's aim is to seek economically, environmentally and socially sustainable land management systems in the uplands. John contributes a number of research programmes to their work, and very important, as far as I'm concerned, at least amongst them, is the impact on biodiversity of declining livestock numbers in the hills. In fact, all the programmes seem most interesting, and I'm tempted to ask him now if he can come back next year and talk about what the centre does. Everything seemed very important. They were even looking at the methane production of cattle in the field. Well, tonight it's John's hobbies that underpin his talk. He's an active bird and plant recorder, as well as a really good photographer, as you'll see. And he's going to talk about the wonderful wildlife around his home in Culzean. So I'll hand over to John and he can screen share with us, I think. That looks good. Is that okay?
Thank you, Roy.
Great.
Hopefully everybody can see that.
I certainly can.
Good evening, everybody. So I've been visiting the head of Loch and the Loch Marshes for nearly 30 years. And over that time, I've had many memorable encounters with wildlife. And I've seen numerous interesting and sometimes rare species. And an early morning visit in spring. Oh, sorry, I'm going to have to stop because I've forgotten to do something. It won't be a minute. My fault. Apologies. I have to share the sound, and I forgot. We'll try that. Hopefully you can hear some background sound. So, as I say, an early morning visit in spring can be a wonderful experience, with the mist hovering over the calm water of the loch, disturbed only by the ripples of a diving otter, while the reeling of a grasshopper warbler emanates from the marsh behind. There's a cuckoo calling from one of the surrounding trees, and there's a faint bubbling call of a black grouse lecking on one of the distant hills. Loch Tay is perhaps not what you would describe as the ideal birding site. It's a large oligotrophic loch. It's surrounded by mountains, and it's about as far away from the sea as you can get in Scotland. However, it's actually quite surprising what has turned up over the years. And I've been recording the birds present at the head of the loch since 2005, and I've collected data for more than 1,500 visits. And over this period, I've recorded 149 bird species, and this includes 49 residents, 27 winter visitors, 15 summer visitors, 18 passage migrants, and around about 40 rare visitors. And some of these are nationally rare, and some of these are just rare to the site. Perhaps the most exciting birdwatching experience on the loch each year is the passage of spring waders as they head north to their breeding grounds. And in some years, this can be really good. It very much depends on the water level. If there's exposed mud and sand, then there's a chance of something turning up. It's usually just one or two birds. And as I say, if it's a wet spring, there aren't any at all. But I always look forward to that in the springtime. So this is just a map of the area. Oh, sorry, have I lost you?
No, I'm still here.
Sorry, I've lost my screen. Won't be a minute. Okay. Yeah, sorry. This is just a map of the SSSI at the head of the loch, the Loch Tay Marshes SSSI. And you can see here that it's composed of a number of different habitats. So in the northern end of the SSSI, there's an area of carr woodland. And then along the edge of the loch is where there's an area of sedge swamp. There's carr woodland on two islands, and then there's more sedge swamp on the south side of the SSSI. So Loch Tay itself is a large freshwater loch in Perth and Kinross and Stirling Council areas. It stretches approximately 23 kilometres in a northeasterly direction from Culin to Kenmore. Not only is there a SSSI on the marshes, but the whole of the loch and the rivers entering the loch form part of the special area of conservation, the River Tay system special area of conservation. And the SSSI is designated for its Atlantic salmon, its brook, river, and sea lampreys, its Eurasian otter, and also for the loch itself, for the aquatic vegetation within the loch. The area to the west of the SSSI is an area of marshy grassland, and this is grazed by sheep from spring through to autumn. And the area down to the south of the SSSI area, that area is grazed mainly by cattle in the summer. This is just a Bing image of the site, just showing some of the main areas. And what I'm going to do today is we're going to go for a sort of virtual wander from Pinlarrig Castle along Pier Road to the head of the loch, past the Carr woodland, through the marshy grassland to the islands. And then we'll have a little wander down the river, and then a quick jaunt to the south side of the loch to the woodland around Furbush. So this is just a view of the loch from above Culin on the way up Clackan. And we're going to head down Pier Road, and our first port of call is Pinlarrig Castle. And this is the remains of a building thought to have been built around about 1609 by Sir Duncan Campbell, who was known as Black Duncan. And it's actually on a site of a much older castle, perhaps 200 years older. Around the ruins, there are a number of interesting plants. There are some quite old yew trees, and there's an ancient holly tree as well. It's a good area for looking for bats. And one of the things that's sort of a highlight at the beginning of the year is the display of snowdrops around the castle. Later on in the spring, this area is also good for cuckoo pint. If we move down Pier Road in early spring, there is a carpet of lesser celandines. And lesser celandines are probably my favorite plant. And I have thousands of photos of lesser celandines. Later in the spring, there's a carpet of bluebells in amongst the dog's mercury. And there are other plants there, things like red campion, there's male fern, there's upland enchanter's nightshade, there's wood sedge and remote sedge as well. And this area is a great place to go for a dawn chorus walk with things like blackcap and garden warbler and chiffchaff. There's the tapping of great-spotted woodpeckers. There's wren, as you can hear there, songthrush and mistlethrush. It's a really great place to listen to the dawn chorus. There are other interesting plants in this bit of woodland. This one is Moscatel, and there's a little patch just beyond Finlarrig Castle, close to the side of the road. And every spring for the last 20 years, I've been to check whether the patch is still there, and it still is, which is always great to see. The woodland along Pier Road is mainly sycamore with some very large beech tree, few oak trees in there. There's some wych elm, a bit of hazel as well. And one of that alias, the big old sycamore trees, is this plant. This is toothwort. It's a parasitic plant, so it's parasitic on the tree roots. Doesn't have any green chlorophyll, and it appears in April, pushing through the leaf litter. It's particularly popular with early bumblebees, and it also seems to be popular with the roe deer, which often nibble off the appearing flower stalks. Quite an uncommon plant in our local area. Only a few sites. Another plant which is quite locally rare that grows along Pier Road is the bird's nest orchid, and this is what's known as a mycoheterotroph. So rather than being parasitic on a tree, it's in effect parasitic on a fungus. It uses a fungus to obtain its nutrients, and the fungus really doesn't get anything back from that. Other woodland plants in Pier Road include things like wood sorrel, and when you're walking down this area in spring, one of the birds that you often hear is the song of the wood warbler, with that sort of they talk about the spinning coin of the wood warbler as it sings. In some of the wetter patches, there are opposite-leaved golden saxifrage, and other birds to look out for are things like spotted flycatcher. There are several pairs of spotted flycatcher that breed in the area, usually in the same sort of spots, the particular areas where they like. And lots of nuthatches. So nuthatches appeared in the area in 2011 was the first time I saw a nuthatch. By 2016, they were common, and now you rarely go to the area without at least hearing one anyway. The woodlands are very good in the winter for redwing, and they're also quite often big flocks of chaffinch and brambling, and they tend to be feeding on the beech mast, which varies from year to year. So some years it's there's lots of it, in other years there's not much. So that does affect what birds are about. Pier Road is also great for tawny owls. In the evening, there's very often tawny owls calling, and they nest in a number of trees along Pier Road, and you can hear the youngsters calling. In terms of fungi, there aren't a huge number of fungi along this part of the woodland, mainly because the sycamore tends not to have associated large fruiting fungi. So you tend to see the fungi underneath the beech trees or in amongst the sort of rotting vegetation. So you get these lots of scarlet elf caps in the late autumn. In terms of mammals, it's a good place to see red squirrel and roe deer and red deer. There are also pine marten and badger in the woodland here. And across the site, you might occasionally see a red fox and possibly, even a stoat. There are a few garden escapes in this area. So there's a patch of spring snowflake. There's some Solomon's seal. There's some Spanish bluebells as well. This makes it an interesting mix of both native and non-native plants. As you get to the end of Pier Road and you reach the gate to go into the head of the loch, there's a wetland area, a small pond by the fence, and this is a really good area for amphibians. So there are frogs and in particular toads. Unfortunately, because it's a road, every spring some toads get squashed as they move from the woodland into the wetland areas. So we've gone through the gate and we're now at the head of the loch, and on our right-hand side is an area of carr woodland. And this is mainly alder and willows, mainly grey willow. And it is a true swamp woodland. I've been, well over welly top, trying to walk through it and thinking I might never get out. But one of the plants that I go to look for is this plant. This is coral root orchid. And there's quite a sizable population here. It varies from year to year. Orchids populations do vary quite a lot. In 2021, I think it was, I was involved in an informal survey, and we recorded 80 flowering spikes of coral root in the woodland. There are other interesting plants in this carr woodland. There's common wintergreen, there's common twayblade, there's woody nightshade growing in swamp. It always surprises me to see it growing there when you normally see it growing in a dry hedge bank. Here it grows in water. There's also skullcap and large bittercress. Coral root, like the bird's nest orchid, is a mycoheterotroph. So it, although it does have some chlorophyll, it has some green in its flowering spikes, it doesn't have any leaves, and it's almost entirely dependent upon its fungal host. Other plants in this area include things like water ravens, and there's marsh marigold. And there's also wood clubrush, and this is more or less at its northern limit in the UK at this site. This is just a view of the loch, and this is the sort of bay between Pier Road, and the trees on the right-hand side are on the Crannog. Between the loch and the carr woodland and the marshy grassland, there is a row of rather majestic veteran pedunculate oaks. And these are wonderful trees, actually, right at the edge of the loch. No idea how old they are, several hundred years old, but wonderful trees. Here with common polypody growing all the way up it. And associated with these oaks, we've got beefsteak fungus, often growing on them, and chicken of the woods as well. So you can have both beef and chicken from these oak trees. There are other fungi, bracket fungus here, one of the trametes, and where there's birch in the Carr woodland, you often get the brown birch bolete. Along with the big old oak trees, there's also this rather impressive Scots pine tree. And this bit of woodland, the oak trees and the Carr woodland, is a great place to look for and listen to redstarts. There are, in most years, at least 3 singing males along this row of oak trees. And along with the redstart, there'll be singing tree pipits as well. And perhaps not as spectacular looking as the redstart, but it doesn't half give its all when it sings. A species that used to nest in this bit of woodland, but sadly no longer does, is the pied flycatcher. And now pied flycatchers are irregular spring passage migrants. As we leave the bit of Carr woodland and move onto the marshy grassland, you can see here there are still scattered oak trees across this area, and there are areas of permanent water. So there are some ponds, including what's known as the Pike Pond. But in the winter, this whole area often floods. Here you can see Clackan, the hill above Culin in the distance there. This marshy grassland is dominated by tufted hairgrass with rushes as well. And there are still a few patches of yellow flag iris, but most of the tall herb vegetation that used to be there, unfortunately, has gone, and it's now fairly species poor. It's still a good place to see roe deer hiding in the grassland, and it's also a good place to look out for cuckoos. Through the spring, you almost always will hear a distant cuckoo somewhere. You don't often see them, and it's usually just in the sort of late summer when you see the young birds like this one, which tend to be less elusive and often sit on posts for you to see. The marshy grasslands also a good area to look for predatory birds. So occasionally you might see a short-eared owl, but I've also seen hen harrier and merlin and peregrine and barn owl all hunting over this area. But these are rare sights rather than the norm. along with the oak trees in this bit of the walk, you'll also see a number of hawthorn bushes. And as I said, there are still patches of yellow flag iris, but flag iris is actually toxic, so it's able to survive grazing, whereas the meadow sweet, which used to be abundant, and things like the common valerian, wild angelica, and the cuckoo flower even, have all declined and now are more or less restricted to the islands, and there's very little growing within the marshy grassland. And I'll talk a little bit more about the grazing later on. Still see orange-tip butterflies where the cuckoo flower survives, and this year there was one field on Pier Road, actually what you would call an improved field, which was absolutely covered in cuckoo flower, and so there were orange tips and green-veined whites there. Still a few bits of ragged robin and the greater bird's foot trefoil hangs on in places as well. But most of the melancholy thistle is now restricted to the islands. A bit of devil's bit scabious hangs on in the grassland, and also another butterfly which is quite often seen now is the ringlet, a species that certainly 20 years ago we would never have seen at the site, but is now quite common in the area. The head of Loch Tay isn't the best place for dragonflies, but there are common hawkers and four-spotted chasers and large red damselflies, amongst others. And in the willow scrub at the edge of the marsh, you'll often hear and sometimes see sedge warblers and reed buntings. And reed buntings breed in the marshy grassland, along with redshank and also snipe. And it's great again in a spring morning to listen to the snipe drumming above the marsh. In March each year, there's a big roost of curlew that roost on the marsh, either on the marshy grassland or sometimes on the sandbank, depending on the water level. And in most years, this number's in excess of 75 birds. A species you hear very often with its rather bizarre squealing call, but don't see very often, is the water rail. I'm not sure how many pairs there are at the head of the loch, but there are several, certainly several calling, squealing males. I mentioned that there are some ponds as well, and one of these is the pike pond, and on the pike pond there is white water lily, and in the other ponds as well there's a lot of bog bean. Back in 2014, I was at the head of the loch in the evening, in May, and I heard this call, and I knew straight away what it was, but it's quite exciting. And that's the call of a spotted crake. I didn't see the bird, but it was around about 10:30 to 11:30 that it was calling. And spotted crakes make that rather bizarre call, and it travels a huge distance. But it was great to hear a spotted crake. Between the marshy grassland and the sedge swamp, there's this ridge of dry, sandy grassland. It's almost like a dune that sort of separates the marshy grassland from the sedge swamp. And this bit of dry grassland has things like silverweed, there's lady's bedstraw, there's sneezewort, lots of harebell, and there's wax caps on this bit as well. But this bit of dry grassland, some years, if the sheep have been put into the field fairly early on, then there's very little flowering, and it also gets heavily trampled by visitors. So most of the SSSI is designated because of its sedge swamp. It's this open water transition fen habitat, and it's dominated by two sedges, bladder sedge and bottle sedge. And it forms quite an extensive cover of sedge-dominated vegetation with patches of willow in amongst them. And beyond this sedge fen swamp area, if the water level drops, you get an extensive area of sand and mud, and this quite extensive sandbar. And that sandbar's very important for birds in the springtime. It's also where common gulls breed. A few pairs try and breed each year, and it's used by other things like black-headed gulls and lesser black-backed gulls, the waders I mentioned about, and things like pied wagtails. Between the sedge and the sandbank, you've got an area which is dominated by this plant, lesser water plantain. This is the creeping form of lesser water plantain. And it forms in some years a sort of pink carpet across this muddy area, along with bulbous rush. Yeah. Here again, you can see the lesser water plantain along the edge of the loch here, and that's a close-up. This is probably one of the largest populations of the creeping form of lesser water plantain in the UK. So it's a very important site for this plant. Along with the lesser water plantain, you've got things like marsh cinquefoil, you've got water mint in there, and various other species, including one which we don't really want, and that's New Zealand pygmy weed, sometimes called Australian swamp stonecrop. It's a non-native invasive species, and it was first seen by a friend in Culin who recorded it probably 3 or 4 years ago, but it is expanding at a quite horrifying rate, and so we'll have to keep an eye on it, but it's one of these species which is very difficult to control once it's in there. A bird which you regularly see at the head of the loch is the osprey, and there is a nest site not too far away, and the birds regularly come and hunt in the shallows at the head of the loch. But they do tend to get harassed by the common gulls and the black-headed gulls if they get too close to the sandbank. Very occasionally, you'll get big flocks of waders turn up, and this was one occasion in I think it was probably in April a few years back, where I had around about 90 black-tailed godwits along with about 35 redshank, and it was quite a spectacle. There was even one of these black-tailed godwits which had colour rings on as well. These birds are the Icelandic subspecies, and they're heading north to breed in Iceland. Greenshank are regular spring migrants, as seen right through the spring periods in small numbers, but they're often there, and I suspect that in some years they do breed locally. A species that has increased significantly in recent years has been the little ringed plover, and so a pair attempted to breed at the site in 2012 but failed, and then I've seen birds including up to 4, so 2 pairs this year. Over the last 6 years there have been birds there. Again this year a pair attempted to breed and it laid eggs, but unfortunately I watched a hooded crow take all the eggs as the poor little ringed plover did its broken wing behavior, trying to lure the hooded crow away, but was not successful. And as you can see in the background there, there's a white wagtail, and it's a great place to see white wagtails. Actually, every spring there's a passage of white wagtails, and up to a dozen in some years. And a couple of years back, I had white wagtails from April through till June. There was some there every day, heading north, probably to Scandinavia. And in the autumn and in the spring, along with the white wagtails, of course, there are dozens and dozens of pied wagtails. And particularly September's a great month to see big numbers of pied wagtails, and sometimes over 150 pied wagtails feeding on the sandbank. Here you've got a little ringed plover again. As well as little ringed plovers, we also get ringed plovers, and here with a group of dunlin, and dunlin are probably one of the commoner waders that you'll see at the site. A species which regularly turns up in 1s and 2s in most years, in spring mainly, is the whimbrel here. with a red shank walking past. And probably the commonest of the waders, perhaps probably also the noisiest, are the oyster catchers. And there's usually oyster catchers there from late January through until the summer, and then they head off to the coast. And occasionally there are other waders. Here there's a small group of 3 sandling, but I've also had knot and turnstone, several wood sandpipers. I had a wood sandpiper this year. So you never know what you might see in terms of waders. This is just looking across the loch towards Ben Glass in the distance there. Here's a white wagtail. Common sandpipers are a common summer migrant that breeds along the edge of the loch and along the rivers. And there's usually a few pairs of common sandpipers about. In terms of waterfowl, there's usually a pair of resident mute swans. Sometimes they raise a family. Most years they seem to have the nest flooded out or fail, but they hang around. Teal, along with mallard, they're both in the summer and winter. In the summer, there'll be red-breasted merganser, which breed on the loch, and goosander, which also breed on the loch. And more and more, I'm seeing summering goldeneye. I mean, they're quite good numbers in winter, but there are still birds present all year round. And in the last 5 or 6 years, they've bred somewhere on the loch. In at least 3 of the years, I've been seeing ducklings on the at the head of the loch, which is great. In the winter, you occasionally see hooper swans, but it's not the best place to see hooper swans. Locally, Loch Docket near Crianlarich is a much better place to see hooper swans, but there's always one or two turn up at some point in the winter. And you'll get other ducks and geese appear occasionally. So here, a couple of barnacle geese, but you might get gadwall or shoveler, occasional shelduck. We had scaup there as well, and long-tailed duck. So scaup and long-tailed duck are ones which you tend to get in winter in particular. Occasionally a mandarin duck will turn up. I've had both male and female mandarins. Herons are almost always present. There's usually 2 or 3 herons about. And particularly in the winter, but at other times of the year as well, there are good numbers of cormorant. And on one particular tree where they roost in winter, you can see up to 30 cormorants roosting in the tree. In the summer, we have black-throated divers. These are a regular sight. In all the time I've been there, though, I've never seen a pair with youngsters. So I don't know whether they've never bred locally or what, but I've never seen any young with them. And I mentioned that you sometimes get rare things turning up. So there's been a range of things. Temming stint has occurred in several years. There was a temming stint there this spring, but a few years back there was one that stayed for a couple of months, and I first saw it I think it was in May, and it was sat on top of a gorse bush, which is not the usual place you expect a small wader to be. So I thought, oh, that's something unusual. And yeah, it was a temming stint. And as I say, it stayed for a couple of months. It did a lot of displaying and singing. Spent a lot of time chasing a common sandpiper, and the common sandpiper was not impressed at all at this little stint, flying after it. But it was great to see it. We've had bar-headed geese on a few occasions, great northern diver and red-throated diver. This great northern diver here in the middle, that was there for a couple of weeks in the summer a few years back. Get scoter, this male scoter was in summer, so usually see them in summer. We've had both adult and juvenile little gull. Redneck phalarope, that was a great day when the redneck phalarope appeared. There was both male and female, so that was great to see. We've had Slavonian grebe in winter, and we occasionally get great crested grebe as well, but not very often, and usually only when it's very cold and the smaller lochs and lochans in central Scotland freeze over, and then the great crested grebe sometimes move to the bigger lochs. Quite often see Arctic turning up in sort of spring passage, not every year, but quite often. I've also had common tern and also once a sandwich tern. So as I say, you never know what you might see. So where have we got to now? So here we're looking over to the island across a stretch of water that they call the canal between the shore and the island here, and this area is particularly good for beavers and otters. The beavers and otters both live on the island there, but it's also a good place in June to watch the common roach spawning, and they jump out of the water, and it's great to watch them, even though roach aren't actually native to the loch, and they've been released lower down in the Tay system and have worked their way up, I think, and are now established in the loch. Here you can see some of the beaver lodges on the island, and there's some typical beaver engineering. The beavers arrived in the area in 2014, and I've now seen them, I think, since 2014, 780 times I've seen the beavers. So it's a good place to see beavers. In the last year, I've visited the area, I think 158 times, and I've seen beavers on 100 occasions. So if you hang around, you're likely to see beavers. And sometimes you'll see a few beavers. Here's 3 sizes, an adult, a sub-adult, and a youngster feeding on birch bark. and he again's having a bit of a rest on the island. Over the years, the beavers have definitely done some engineering. The landscape has changed. Of course, they're not damming anything. They don't need to dam anything. But they've created lodges, and they've chopped down a lot of trees on the island, and particularly some of the areas of willow, which they've more or less completely chopped down. And locally along the river, they do like aspen, and there's been quite a lot of aspen that they've taken down. So, for example, opposite the Culzean Hotel in Culzean, on the river there's some quite a nice stand of aspen, which the beavers have been working their way through, which I think annoys some people, but it's great to sit at the hotel and watch the beavers. Otters are also present, and again regularly seen. So I've seen the otters, not quite as often as the beavers, but still quite often. In the last year, I think I've seen them over 50, 60 times in 2023. So yeah, probably once in every 3 visits I would see the otter. This is just looking down the river where the Docker and the Loch meet, and this is a good spot to watch the beavers and otters. Best time to see them is in the evening or early morning. You can see otters out during the day, but in this area I've never seen beavers out in the middle of the day. It's always been in the evening or early morning. Whereas at the weekend I saw an otter out in the middle of the afternoon. We'll just have a little quick walk down the river, so along the Docket and the Loch, and you'll find dippers. They very often breed under the old railway bridge over the Loch, and along with grey whitetails, which are very often there as well. And to finish off, we'll move a little way round the head of the Loch, just to the south side of the Loch, along the South Loch Tay Road, and have a look at the woodland along the edge of the Loch there, because this is really interesting bit of woodland. It's oak, birch, hazel woodland, old coppice hazel woodland, but it has a number of woodland species that we don't get along Pier Road. So there's wild garlic here, ramsons. There's also lots of wood anemone, and the other golden saxifrage, the alternate leaved golden saxifrage. And there's both oak fern and beech fern in this bit of woodland. But it's particularly special, I would say, for the primroses and the violets that you get along this bit of woodland and along the roadside in May. So we're back to the head of the loch to listen to the grasshopper warbler singing in the marshy grass. They're really difficult to see. It's one of these species where you sort of, he's flown all the way from Africa. He drops down into this bit of grassland, and it doesn't appear to move more than about 5 meters, and then flies back to Africa. It just seems bizarre, but there we are. They seem to manage. So just a few slides of the loch, different times of year. I thought I'd sort of finish the slideshow just talking a little bit about threats to the site. It is a SSSI. It is a special area of conservation, or parts of it are. So it does have some degree of protection, but it does get a lot of disturbance from people, from dogs in particular, which run onto the sandbank and through the marsh, disturbing the birds. The poor common gulls almost every year fail to raise any youngsters, either because the sandbank gets flooded, or, as probably happened this year, people with dogs running across the sandbank, disturbing them from their nests. I'm not a fan of dogs, and I wish people would keep them on leads when they go through this sort of area. But I do recognize that it is a place which people want to enjoy, and taking your dog for a walk is something that people want to do. But it does disturb the wildlife. Canoes, kayaks, and fishing boats are also do cause some disturbance. Too often people want to see the beavers from a boat and sit outside the beaver lodges, and you know, if only they'd just be on the bank, the beavers would come out, but they won't come out if you've got the boat right in front of the lodge there. We occasionally have problems with speedboats and jet skis. It's not frequent, but it does happen. Camping, to a degree, can be an issue, particularly if there's any damage to trees or fires. And camping on the islands is becoming a regular thing now, so even the islands aren't safe. Litter is a problem to a degree, although it's not in most of the time it's not too bad, and a lot of local people collect litter when they're doing their regular walks around the site. Inappropriate grazing levels have in recent years, as I mentioned, reduced the amount of tall herb vegetation within the marshy grassland. And this, of course, is not part of the SSSI, so it's not protected. It used to be under a agri-environment scheme with the previous owner, but this is 15, 20 years ago. But it's now leased out to a local farmer, and I have no criticism about the farmer grazing animals there. I mean, it's a resource, but in terms of the vegetation, it has had an impact. There is this issue of invasive non-native species, in particular this New Zealand pygmy-weed, which is a potential threat, particularly to the lesser water plankton. It's not really a threat erosion and deposition, but it's changing the landscape of the loch. So the river bank is being eroded away, and the sandbank is getting bigger. So it is changing. I suppose you could put into the beavers as well. I would certainly wouldn't call them a threat, but they are engineers and they are having an impact. Pollution to a degree. So the local sewage works for Cullen is next to the river, and that may have an impact, as perhaps the very large pile of grit for the roads at the depot, which again is next to the river. There is a risk from that. Climate change, of course, having an impact on everything. And I suppose lastly, you know, as I say, these are designated, notified sites, but whether they actually provide real protection, I sometimes wonder. They do give some protection, and that's great, but whether it really protects the wildlife, I'm not sure. And that's just a final slide looking towards the Crianlarich Hills, Stubinian and Benmore down the river. What I'd like to do, if Roy's all right with this, is that I do have a video. It's about 10 minutes, which I'd like to see whether it works or not. If that's all right, I shall see whether I can get it to work. Be a minute while I hunt for it. Okay, we'll see whether this will work or not. I hope that worked all right.
Yes, it did. I was certainly enjoying it.
Good, good.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay, that was fantastic. I mean, one of the worst things I think about Zoom is that we can't end this talk with a great round of applause. We had a talk once with 400 people at it, and there was deadly silence at the end. So the next time I recorded the applause at the end of a promenade concert and played that back. And forgot to do it today, but you deserve it. That is magnificent talk.
We can take off our mute and clap.
Yeah, but I don't think it would sound right somehow. Anyway, thank you very much, John. Now, have we got any questions? I remember seeing one go past, which was to ask about bats.
Yeah, there's, if you want, there's a couple of questions.
Yeah.
So yeah, one is bats. Can you tell us a little bit about the bats around there, John?
Yes, I should have told you about bats. I don't know how I missed that off. Yeah, so there are common pipistrelle and soprano pipistrelle and brown long-eared in the woodland and feeding over the marshes, and you know, Daub entons on the river and feeding over the water as well. Now, whether there are any others, I don't know, but there may be. But it is a good place to see bats. Yeah.
There was a question as well about, does your bird list include gannet?
It does, yes, yes. So yeah, there were a few coastal birds that appear. So I have had gannet over the loch, and regularly, almost every year, there's guillemots. So there was a guillemot there on Saturday, for example, floating along the river. And I even had one year a juvenile razorbill, and interestingly, though I didn't see it, this year, just a bit down the loch, towards well, partway down the loch, towards Kenmore, a dead Manx shearwater was found. So goodness only knows how that ended up so far inland. Yeah.
I think just one last question, because we're running tight for time.
Yeah.
Have you seen any egrets there yet?
No, that's on my list. Yeah. So there are a few things that are on my list that hopefully will turn up at some point. So egret is little egret is probably top of that. Oh, even great egret would be nice as well. Yeah, but there are a few things. I still haven't seen any gargany. That's another species I would quite like to see there. And although I regularly see white-tailed eagles where I work, and I know white-tailed eagles have been at the head of the loch and elsewhere on the loch, I have never seen one yet. So that's also still on my list to see. Yeah.
I was a bit worried about the disturbance issues, and you can only see them getting worse, particularly if we have wonderful talks like this. Is there any attempt by Nature Scott to inform the public, keep dogs on leads, that sort of thing? Or maybe there's a case for having hides where people can watch the beavers, which perhaps would stop them the disturbance they cause. Is there much? You implied that there wasn't much activity from the people overseeing the SSSI.
Well, I mean, it is a very popular place for locals and visitors, and you know, how do you? It would be very difficult to restrict that. I mean, with the current access legislation, there is no control. You know, there is nothing you can do about the number of visitors, dogs, cycles, boats, camping, all these sorts of things. Whether it's the SSSI or not, it doesn't matter. And yeah, that worries me, but that's not anything to do with this site. It's simply the fact that the access legislation, though great in many respects for wildlife, I think is an utter disaster. Really is not good for wildlife.
Is there any attempt to keep jet skis and motor speedboats and that sort of thing out of the area? I've seen areas penned off for that.
I mean, it's. I think there is a code of conduct which asks people not to have jet skis or speedboats at high speed around the head of the loch there. You know, there's protection around the osprey's nest. And you know, it's not like in some places, you know, I mean, it could be terrible, but I mean, I have been watching the beavers as 2 jet skis have come down along the river past the island, causing big wakes, you know, and yeah, it's. But again, you know, people have come to enjoy themselves, and that's how they enjoy themselves. But yeah, it's not great for wildlife.
Certainly isn't. Well, I think it sounds as though I ought to wrap this up. I wanted to screen share because we've got some. Can you screen share that? I can't see if you could see it.
No, we can't see it, Roy.
I've got something on my screen. Do I have to press screen share?
Yeah, you have to share screen.
Oh, where do I get that then?
Should be a big green button in the middle near the bottom.
I have no green. No, I'll reduce this. Hold on. Have I got it now? Oh yeah, okay. Sorry, I'm really inept at this. And I still can't see green screen share.
Is it the PowerPoint that we had at the start?
That's part of it. Yes, I'll have to put it up and read it, I think. So no screen share. No, I had it earlier on as well. Okay, I'll have to read it, I'm afraid. First of all, our next talk is on the lives of cuckoos. I'm not that interested in birds, but my God, I'm interested in cuckoos. They must be the most interesting bird we've got. And the talk is going to be on the lives of cuckoos by James Silver of the RSPB. And the date is November the 5th. On one of the Facebook ads, it was wrong. It's November the 5th, Tuesday, November the 5th at 7:30. So I hope you'll all come to that. Then there is the Scottish Wildlife Trust branch in Calendar on Thursday, the 12th of October, has a talk which I think we've had in our program actually. It's called Bats and Trees, Radio Tracking Tree Roosting Bats in Western Scotland. And that is on the 12th of October at 7:30, and it's a live talk for those who like live talks in St Andrew's Church Hall in Calendar. The talk after that is a talk which might be interesting to the students doing environmental science. On Thursday, the 16th of November, there's a talk on climate change in our oceans, and it's by Emily Parry of the Marine Conservation Society. Now, lastly, there is an all-day conference, the annual conference of the Fourth Naturalist and Historian, and it's going to be held at Stirling University on Saturday, the 11th of November, from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. So it's an all-day live conference, and it's on aspects of local extractive industries, the history, impact, and recovery. Details and booking forms are on the Fourth Naturalist and Historian website. So if you just Google Fourth Naturalist and Historian website, you'll find a column which says start here, and it has conferences and under that you'll find a booking sheet with all the details, but it deals with local coal mining before 1750, gold exploitation, Air 3 copper mine, landscape legacies of coal mining, the flora of local mines and quarries, bats in Aberfoyle Slate Quarry, citizen science biodiversity at Gartmorn, and mine water pollution. So there's a whole range of conferences there, some live, and ours will be Zoom again. So thank you all. I want to make one last list of thank yous, just to show you, you know, how many people are involved in getting this talk today. There's obviously the speaker who's put hundreds and hundreds of hours into the talk. We have a committee that put forward various people for talks. Those suggestions were taken up by Liz, one of our committee members who does planning. That's her main job. And she wrote to all the people and arranged for them to come. And Stuart, who has been working in the background there, doing the IT stuff, he was going to run the show today, but he's hurt himself. And so at the last minute, Guy, our chairman, had to take over. So thanks, Guy. Hope you recover, Stuart. Melissa actually sends all the details of these programs off and arranges the Eventbrite program. And we have one member of the committees in Germany. It's Gabby. I don't know whether she was watching tonight, but she runs the web page. And of course, there's a Facebook page too, where these adverts go out. So all those people are involved in getting this to you tonight. And I'd like to thank all of them on your behalf for that. So that's it. 4 weeks time, cuckoos. And it should be very interesting. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.